Okay. Set that aside then.
Yeah.
Our panelists this afternoon will be introducing themselves, giving you a little bit of background. Rich Baich, Joseph Ansanelli, and Paul Proctor, and going to give them a chance to introduce themselves and then get things rolling. So, Rich?
Test. A little bit louder, I guess. As Adam said, my name is Rich Baich. I'm the former Chief Information Security Officer at ChoicePoint. I recently resigned, and I have a new position as the Managing Director of PricewaterhouseCoopers. I've been in the information security business world in the government military sector as well as the commercial sector for the past 12 years.
I'm Joseph Ansanelli. I'm the CEO and co-founder of an information security software company called Vontu, and we provide software to help companies discover, monitor, and prevent against the distribution from the inside out of confidential data such as customer information or intellectual property. And have spent a lot of time with these folks and have spent a fair amount of time actually testifying on this issue on Capitol Hill. And I think one of the things we'll touch on today is some of the regulatory issues with respect to personal information.
My name is Paul Proctor. I am an analyst with Gartner, so I talk for a living. But I can give you a couple of reasons why I deserve a little bit more respect. One of them was that I've been doing security for about 20 years, and I started out my life as a kernel programmer on Unix, but as I said, these days I talk for a living. And the other is that I was part of the Metagroup acquisition. So I am new to Gartner, so go easy on me, and I'll go easy on you.
Thanks, guys. I'd like to start out to frame the question of the future of personal information by looking to the past and thinking back hundreds of years, where instead of there being personal information, there was a person, and that person had a reputation that was tied to them, to their family, to their history. About 50, 60 years ago, with the rise of computers, of credit bureaus, people started trading information about people, that they would collect your name, your address, your social security number, and they would collect a history of your performance on loans, your character, and other things. As we've moved into the information age, that's been very advantageous. It's possible to go and buy a car with no money down based on someone pulling your credit history and deciding to give you this very expensive object based on your credit. Well, over time, people have figured out that the small bits of information that are in your credit file are very valuable, that with those bits of information, you can commit fraud. You can impersonate someone and take out a loan in their name. And that problem, according to the FTC, is costing individuals about $5 billion a year right now, and companies about $50 billion. And it's the fastest growing crime in the United States. There's not only financial fraud. People are obtaining identification cards with other people's names on them. Criminals are doing this so that when they're arrested and they get out on bail, because they have no prior record, someone else gets arrested by the bail bondsman. Someone else is summoned to court. And so we're starting to see people take advantage of the personal information in the way that it's handled, manipulated, traded, sold. And so we come together today to ask, what is the future of personal information? And I'm going to ask each of my panelists to give me a short little idea on that.
The future still, I believe, is unpredictable. However, if you go back just this year in 2005, and you look at the number of organizations that have publicly gave notice that information, in particular personal identifiable information, had either been stolen, defrauded, or lost from their organization, have caused individuals, citizens, state and federal legislators to begin to try to figure out how to minimize the impact of that information. Consequently, A lot of individuals have obviously personal opinions on how that information should be protected. I believe that the future of the protection of that information is kind of going to have to go through a life cycle approach, very similar to the holistic approach to traditional information security. So, again, we're going to start back at the beginning and understand that it's an asset within a company. Companies are going to have to understand their assets. From there, they're going to have to obviously do a risk analysis and determine what's an acceptable risk of that information. For example, do I need to carry a full Social Security number? Do I need to store it? Maybe I can just store the last four, or maybe I can use other information. That information then within the companies, they have to classify that information, have some type of internal classification. From there, they're going to have to build the appropriate safeguards around that classification, very similar to how the government protects information today from a confidential, secret, and top secret standpoint. Each of those levels demand a different type or level of safeguard. And in addition to that, the organizations have to then think about the destruction, storage, and sharing of that information. Are there appropriate measures and tools in place to allow the organization to do that? So not only will it be their responsibility to protect the information at their physical location, but they'll also have to protect it in the cyber world and also potentially on their employees' home computers, because they might download it or bring information home, so they need to make sure that there's policies, standards, and tools. And then the last point, their partners. The personal information, I think, is going to become a significant part of third-party sharing and requirements of those third-party. So the future of PII rests with developing and adhering to some type of methodology. It's not going to be there is no single solution. It's going to be unique for each organization, but a methodology has to be designed. What that methodology will be, I can't suggest to you that. Is it an ISO standard? Is it a BS standard? Is it something part of a COBIT? Some type of discipline will have to be published and utilized in the industry.
So I don't have a technical degree. I have a degree in economics, so I'm going to just ask some questions, if that's okay. So I want to start by asking a question. How many people took their car in for service in the last 12 months? Raise your hands. Okay, who hasn't? Not everyone has changed oil in the last 12 months? Okay, so how many people have gotten a credit report in the last 12 months? That's actually a pretty enlightened group, about 30%. That's pretty good. Pardon me? Courtesy of LexisNexis. Okay, how many of them got them for free because I got a notice from someone in the last 6 months that they should go and check their credit report? Yeah. So my view on sort of what's going to happen around personal information in the future is that, number one, I think people need to realize that you as an individual have an obligation and a responsibility to understand what information credit processing companies have about you. And it's actually fairly easy to get at that today. It's a lot easier than it was a few years ago. And my view is that we need to take ownership of our data in the same way that we take care of our car.
Shouldn't that be free?
You can get 3 credit reports free every year right now. You can go to the 3 major credit reporting agencies, and from each of them, you can get 1 free a year. So there's 3 of them. So every 4 months, you can get a free credit report. Now, most people don't know that, and that's not a good thing. But you can do that, right? So go to Equifax, TransUnion, and what's the third one? Experian, thank you. You can get one right now. And then they also, and people have questions about whether this is a good thing or not, they will also sell you a service for $50 a year that can do credit monitoring and email you when someone goes and does anything to your credit. Questionable whether or not that should be free or not, but you know what? $50 to keep an eye on your credit versus $50 to change your oil. $50 on your credit every year is probably not a bad expense. Well, that's why, like I said, you can get 3 free every year. Right? Pardon me?
There are going to be 3 different ones potentially because each of the agencies has different groups of them.
Okay, so lots of questions. This is good. Let's take one at a time. So there was a question over here. Have you gotten yours? Have you ever seen one? I mean, I think it's you have to look at it. There's some basic information in there which you should be able to say whether it's correct or not. Is your address correct? Is your former employer correct? Like I used to consult for a few years before I started Vontu, and they said my former employer was John Ansanelli. Well, I'm Joseph, so they clearly had that wrong. So, I think that there can they get better about how to explain what's on the credit report? Absolutely. But the first step in the process is people should know that they should go look at it. And then they should have a certain sense of responsibility to it. Now, the second thing I'll say is that companies in the future have to have a greater responsibility as stewards of the data to protect it. And I think that that's happening both from sort of market dynamics, being an economics guy, but also happening legislatively. I mean, today is an interesting day. Today in the Senate, both the Commerce Committee and the Judiciary Committee both were reviewing new consumer data security laws that they're going to take to the floor sometime in the next few months. So I think that companies are going to have a greater responsibility and obligation across the board. Right now we've got laws for financial services and healthcare to protect personal information. My view is in the next 12 months that if you store personal information and you're a company that has it, you'll have an obligation to have some standards to protect it. The third thing, though, I want to say in terms of the future, my fear in the future about this is that we're going to take the companies that store data and make them into the criminals, and we're going to forget that the true criminals that are taking consumer data and doing something illegal with it are the people that are actually committing the fraud. It's the people that are stealing the information and doing financial fraud or identity theft that we have to make sure we don't lose sight of, and we have to deal with that in a law enforcement fashion. We have to go after those people, put them in jail, whether they're terrorists or criminals or whatever, and deal with this problem, and also understand that this problem is never going to go away. The issue of identity theft is a crime, like every other crime that's out there, and we can try to reduce it as much as we want, but just like we're never going to eliminate murder and we're never going to eliminate financial crimes, this crime is not something that's going to ever go away and something we're going to have to live with for the rest of our lives. So those are some comments and hopefully a little controversy.
Well, let me start right in with the controversy. We all had lunch together, so for us this is actually like a 3-hour panel because we've been discussing this stuff for at least the last 2 hours. And one of the things that came up at lunch was Joseph was talking about who are the criminals, and I was pointing out that to some degree the companies are responsible because sort of from my position as an analyst, for those of you who don't know about what an analyst does, we spend about 70% of our time talking to enterprise clients, people who work in large companies who have the responsibilities of addressing these issues. And then sort of the value that we bring, hopefully, is to bring some of that knowledge from what everybody else is doing over to the other organizations. So for those of you that thought we just dealt with vendors, that's not the case. Now, the problem here is that here's what I've found. Companies aren't doing nearly enough to protect this data. I mean, we all have examples of getting on the phone with somebody and them saying, well, may I have your social security number, please? It's only within the last few years that we have started taking personal responsibility, as Joseph suggests, and started saying, well, do you really need that social security number? And the fact that all of you picked this talk, that they're at this conference and picked this talk to come into, I'll bet you most of you recognize that whole social security number as an issue. Well, think about the hundreds of millions of people in the world and right here in the United States. It's not really part of the common consciousness to worry about these things. So we can talk about the criminals that are out there doing this, and we can have a control from the government to set up penalties to make it not be a problem anymore, but organizations have got to recognize it and do more. And one of those things along that same subject is, why hasn't the government passed a law to make it impossible, to make it not legal to use something like a social security number? Oh, they've tried. The problem is that the government has social security numbers so integrated through all of their systems that the OMB usually stops them and says, well, we'll have to shut down the government if you actually pass this law. And that's why they never actually get passed, and that's why it's going to be a long time coming. So to some degree, we are going to be forced to taking our own personal responsibility. Now, from my perspective, the future of PII has to do with organizations. I mean, from my perspective, the one thing I like about the makeup of this panel is you couldn't have 4 more different viewpoints or perspectives on the problem. And the one that I bring to it is definitely from talking to organizations and understanding their issues, because they call me up and usually the question is, well, what product should I buy to protect all this personal information because we want to prevent this identity theft thing. So I would like to bring, as we get into the discussions, talking about what it means to create reasonable and appropriate controls. I cover compliance over at Gartner, and have had a lot of experience in talking with companies what they're doing and what they're not doing successfully. And I can tell you it's pretty sad out there. The example that I use is sort of the swimming pool metaphor. Is if you have no fence around your swimming pool and a child falls into it and it drowns, well, you're probably liable. Well, if you have a velvet rope set up and some signs saying don't come over here, and a child walks into your swimming pool and drowns, you're probably liable. If you put a 3-foot fence up, well, you're probably still liable. What about a 5-foot fence? What about a fence with, barbed wire at the top and guard dogs behind it and all sorts of stuff like that? Well, in one case, you're probably overspending on security and you're beyond what the standard of due care is, and in the other case, you're probably not going far enough. The issue is, from a liability standpoint, that this is something that's decided at the time of the infraction. Did you do enough? So this is what organizations are struggling with every day. And I think that, at least from an organizational standpoint, how many people in here are from organizations that have to protect PII? How many people are in here because they're consumers and are interested in finding out what's going to be happening with my data? Okay, a few more. Well, pretty much everybody.
That should be everybody. If you are the company.
How many of you have gotten a notice in the last year? The 1386-like notices. Anybody gotten more than 2? See, this is amazing to me because I've received about 8 of these. And I'm a California citizen. Any California citizens in here? A few. Yeah, you know what? That was actually the same area where the collection of people that had gotten notices were. So anyway, the talking about the laws and what companies require and how far they're going to go is probably what's going to decide how much of this issue we're going to be able to address beyond what individuals can do.
Paul, I want to pick up on what you're talking about, the swimming pool, because I think it's a great analogy. But the truth is, my personal information is your swimming pool, and the fraud comes and affects me when you don't choose to put up that fence. And Joseph mentioned the economics, and I think that this is a great example of a place where the risk is being transferred from the people who hold the information, who may or may not have the ability, the controls in place to protect it, and the person who's going to have to deal with the results of that information being stolen or misused. How do we bring those in line? How do we take them and say, if your company discloses the information, you're not necessarily paying all of the costs of the cleanup. Is that right? Should we be arranging the liabilities differently, and if so, how?
Well, as I pointed out, nobody's doing it right. So ultimately your question comes down to who can we blame? And I notice Rich has the microphone.
That was too easy.
I'm sorry. And we made a pact that we weren't going to take pot shots at Rich, so I apologize for that. But ultimately, and there's 2 levels of concern here. Is one, when you say, your swimming pool is owned by somebody else, we've got the issue of I'm an individual, that a company who I didn't necessarily give permission to has my information. That's one level. And then we got another level of indirection, which is then they share that information with their partners. There is a huge subject of concern around who has the liability. If we look at the card systems failure recently, card systems was essentially a supplier, a partner of all the credit card companies to do transaction clearing. Okay, so maybe you gave permission to, Visa to take your data to some degree, but did anybody ever mention card systems? And oh, by the way, card systems seems like they're going to get the shaft in all of this, probably completely go out of business because everybody's going to stop doing business with them. But what about Visa? Is there any liability there? So, deciding who holds the responsibility, that's why this is a very, very messy problem.
So on the question of liability, the thing that I would add is, first of all, liability takes a couple of different forms, right? If you look at the companies that have had, and let's be clear, of all the cases that have occurred in the last 6 to 9 months, some people say 50-60 million records. We haven't had 50 to 60 million incidents of identity theft. We have not had that. What we've had is 50 to 60 million records have been potentially exposed in some way, shape, or form. So the question is, what's the risk, what's the liability associated with that? Well, there is, to bring it back to economics, there is a market liability in that, one, I think it was DSW that just disclosed on how much it cost them to deal with their breach. It was in the order of $15 million. And the $15 million was the cost to notify all the consumers. It was to send out the free credit reporting services that they allow people to sign up for. It was the staffing of a call center. I don't know if anyone knows this, but in a call center, just for the phone to ring at a call center costs a company on the order of $30 to $50 for the call. One. It's the cost of lawyers. It's the cost of PR people. So a $15 million hit for a retailer is actually a big deal. So companies, in my opinion, are starting to realize, just market dynamics, that it's very expensive for this to happen. It's in their best interest to protect it. Second thing is the intangible aspects of it, the reputational damage that happens to a company. I mean, no offense, but 6 months ago, no one had ever heard of a company called ChoicePoint, right? And everyone knows who they are now. So that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, they didn't want to necessarily be known, right? So market and reputational risk, potential for loss of customers, loss of business is a huge liability. I think the third area, and this is the area that's sort of happening right now, and I think this is to your question a bit, Adam, is what's going to happen from a legal liability standpoint? Right now, it's very unclear. If you're not in financial services or in healthcare covered under Gramm-Leach-Bliley or under HIPAA, you maybe have a little bit of an issue because if you do business in California with California 1386, but there is no national unified consumer data security standard. And I think it's a little odd that we, as a country, require a financial organization that stores my social security number. They have a responsibility to protect it. But I just went and got a new cell phone last week, and they asked for my social security number. Now, why is it that my cell phone company doesn't have the same exact responsibility to protect the data as my financial institution is beyond me. So I do think that one of the things we're going to see is that national consumer data security standard set. Because you can't go to a company and go after them if you haven't told them what they're supposed to do. If you haven't set a standard, it's really hard to hold them accountable to it. So the first step in the process is we need to set that standard, in my opinion.
You had your hand up, sir?
Absolutely. So I don't know if everyone could hear what he said, but what he said is I underestimated the actual cleanup costs. So the $10 to $15 million in the case of DSW, for example, there are actually significant costs above and beyond that, especially when you account for the consumers that may have been victims, if they are a victim of identity theft, what it costs them, the time it takes them, the cost to deal with it. I mean, I think this FTC study said on average it's 80 hours of time plus about $1,000 to $2,000 in cost to a consumer to deal with an issue as well. So the costs are staggering. And my point is, I think, and you would agree, is that it's very expensive for these things to happen, which is in everyone's best interest to stop them from happening.
To piggyback on the rest of the analysts and what they've said, the cost and the liability, I'm sure that Gartner analysts will be coming out and providing us perfect guidance that 3 to 6% of our total budget should be spent at protecting our personal information. Any comment when you guys are coming out with that research? I didn't think so. Anyway,
is this a goose and gander thing going on here?
All I want, make sure you recommend a company called Vontu software.
But my approach to
it's degenerating up here.
My approach to the liability question is a little bit different. I think everybody in this room understands, in your background being information security, this problem isn't something new. This problem is just now finally coming to grips. I would suggest to you it's coming to grips because we've gotten better at what we do. And when I say better at what we do, we're detecting it. And companies are maturing and realizing that they need to communicate this to individuals, whether that was driven by legislation, whether that's been driven by corporate ethics, various different reasons. But the reality of it is, it's finally beginning to come public. The analogy that I like to use is, if you go back to, I want to say it was 1980-81, there was a movie called Superman 2 with Richard Pryor, you might remember, where he's able to shave off 0.5 cent of the payroll and became a very wealthy person. That happened a long time before we started talking about firewalls and antivirus and patch management and all of these functions. So I think when we think about how we're going to protect against the liability of whose responsibility is it to protect the information, I think it's our individual responsibility. We kind of have our own responsibility. Corporations also have their responsibility. I'm going to answer the question in a rhetorical standpoint. How many people have antivirus on their machines at home? Firewalls, understand how to patch their machines. That wasn't the same amount of hands 3 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So I'll now ask the question, how many people protect their personal information at home? How many people think they adequately protect their information at home? That's a big word. You can talk about whether do you encrypt it on your disk, do you keep your computer by the window, do you lock your doors, do you have an alarm system? There's lots of things that you can do. It's kind of a personal risk factor that you think about. But I would suggest to you what we're going to see from a liability standpoint is corporations taking action, and some actually offer identity theft insurance as part of their corporate benefit program. You yourself can subscribe to products which alert to you when somebody is actually going out and trying to get credit or applying for credit cards. So there are some things that you can do personally. So if you use the analogy of how we've matured in a traditional information security world, I would suggest you'll see the same maturity occurring over a defense in-depth structure as it relates to protecting personal information. Corporations will take action, but so will we as individuals in our own homes have to take action.
You said there was someone out there.
We got
Yeah,
several
question over
questions.
here.
Questions out here.
I may be the only one who has this opinion, but it seems to me my identity, information about what I do, who I am, how I like to spend my money, my free time, it's valuable. Everybody is making money off of it except me.
You're not the only one with that opinion.
Can I give you my analogy to that? And this is just an analogy. Go back in time, banks, right? When we originally started having banks, where did the bad guys go? The banks. Why? Because your money was there. What were the banks doing with your money? They might have been storing it. Through time, what do they do with your money now? They make money with your money. You're less afraid of your money being stolen now because you don't worry about that because it's insured and you don't see it happening. So again, I think there'll be a natural evolution of personal information. But 100 years ago, I think your opinion was everybody's opinion with their own personal money because the banking system hadn't evolved the way it is. Just an analogy.
We have some comments over here.
It's a great point. Can people hear? The The point is about the ability to freeze your credit report and forbid people from opening new accounts, forbid people from drawing on that information. And it's actually not called a fraud alert, it's called a credit freeze. And it's in some of the new consumer protection legislation that's come in the last 6 months. In some states it's been put in place, in other states it's been blocked because various users of instant credit, the automotive dealerships, blocked an Idaho law that would allow anyone to put a credit freeze in place.
Let's not forget that, easy credit is the lubrication of today's economy. And,
Yep.
Companies, they look at the fraud that they're experiencing, and they're saying, you can walk into any department store, heck, you can walk into Fry's, and they don't let you walk out unless they say, "And would you like to open a credit account today?" And you can do that pretty much on the spot immediately and walk out with your big screen TV. They don't necessarily want to stop that. So having controls like what we're talking about in place kind of grind that to a halt a little bit. It's not so easy anymore, and that will affect the economy.
Shouldn't it be someone's choice, though? I mean, we're talking about, are you taking steps at home to protect your information? And really, if you encrypt your hard drive, if you shred every piece of paper that comes into the house, when someone gets a hold of your social security number, those steps that you've taken no longer have an impact. So shouldn't it be someone's choice whether or not they're going to allow credit to be drawn in their name?
So So California just passed a law. So California residents right now can put a credit freeze at any time they want.
California only.
Correct. But I think oftentimes, as we've seen, as California goes, sometimes the rest of the nation goes. So I think you have a really good point. I think that, I happen to be from California. We've passed some bad laws too, though. But I think the thing I would say is, right now, if you have not called your senator or your representative to tell them about this, then we're all to blame. Because right now, they're looking at legislation to pass to fix this problem, and that is definitely one of the things that I think should happen.
So
there should be more control. So just call up your senator and legislator and say, hey, if you're looking at consumer data security law, can you make sure there's a provision that allows me to put a credit freeze so no one can get credit automatically without me looking at it? So call up, and I suggest you do it, because there are people looking at that right now. Yep. So the question for folks who might not have heard it is, if you're a consumer and someone has information about you, like a credit reporting agency or what's referred to as a data broker, which is what the classification of a company like ChoicePoint is put into today, what rights does a consumer have to check and validate the accuracy of that information and correct that information? So right now, the major credit reporting agencies under something called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which was renewed in November of 2003, have much more strict requirements for letting consumers, that's the reason for the free credit report, that they have to be able to respond and validate the accuracy of that. The issue around data brokers is that there's a legal question of whether they're covered under FCRA. So one of the bills that's being discussed today in the Senate Commerce Committee deals with that exact issue and basically takes the same exact requirements that credit reporting agencies have in terms of letting consumers see access to that data and correcting it. That law, if it were to be passed, would give consumers the same exact ability to call up ChoicePoint and say, what do you have on me? And that's incorrect, and they have to fix it.
Which, by the way, is exactly the way it is in Europe today. I mean, you talk about the European privacy laws and the fact that those are now becoming the model around the world for the way they construct privacy laws, and all of this notice and choice and accuracy and all of these advantages. They figured this out a long time ago. Now, it's a different story that they're not really enforcing it. But at least it exists.
Blue shirt.
Sitting here as a European listening to this thing, oh, this is crazy. Because, I mean, people are known, which is second generation, has gone through
No, you're right. Now, but on the subject of whether it's all
To
being...
repeat the comment, the Europeans have universal laws that they believe work reasonably well. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, do you believe that they're being enforced? That was half a yes, because the reality is that... Right, and there is no doubt that the EU definitely took the lead on this privacy stuff, and I mean that it's a double-edged sword to some degree, because a lot of times the privacy issues run afoul of, say, monitoring issues for security. I mean, particularly in Germany, because the European law essentially allows for each one of the individual states, can I call them that? To essentially develop their own laws about how they're going to meet the overarching law. And in Germany, they're particularly strict, and in France, they've got some that are, I guess the way I would put it is difficult to interpret, because typically, and anybody in here that perhaps has done business with an organization in the EU, and they run into these, vendors in particular, if you try to sell your product into Europe and you find out that you can't sell it, like log monitoring systems are very hard to sell into, particularly Germany, because the companies basically say we can't use that. So, I mean, but the issue with enforcement is basically that they've taken the lead, but what we have found, again, from some of our European analysts have basically reported to us that a lot of companies, the example that you give from the Boy Scouts to every organization and all the way up, it's true, but it's more of it's unfair to say this, but it's a perspective that they take, which is a good thing. When it comes to actually enforcing all of those things, what you find is that your data is not as accurate as you would hope it would be, or what the law actually requires.
At least I have tried to progress. I can go to police, for example, and say, give me my record out of the international computer.
Yes, and there's a law up in Canada called PIPEDA. Are there any Canadians in here? Because the cool thing about PIPEDA, I remember reading it when it first came out about 3 years ago, there's actually a section in there that talks about jackbooted thugs knocking down your door if they think that you're violating one of the privacy laws. I thought it was fairly harsh, but I think they were doing it just to make a point.
Yeah, legislation, as you all know, is forthcoming. You can read about it. They're talking about it. States are passing different laws. But I think we need to make sure we give ourselves a reality check. It's going to take a long time. The changes that people in this room and people in the industry that are taking aren't going to help us today, tomorrow, 5 years, or even 10 years from now. It might help our kids and our kids' generation. And why would I say that? Because there's so much information already readily available about you out there. Who remembers carbon copies for credit cards? Okay, we all know that that was your credit card number. How many people used to sit there and watch the person rip it up? Not many, right? It evolved, and we did away with carbon copies, and then we were smart, right? We did away with the carbon copies, but then we left the whole credit card number on a receipt. We evolved, right? Now last 4 or 5 digits. How many people remember checks? Social Security numbers were on checks in the 70s, weren't they? Right? God, somebody out there probably has boxes and boxes of checks from your parents to, pending also from you out there with your Social Security number on it. So, as this evolves, I think it's very good that, obviously, personally, everyone has their own opinion on this, but please just keep in mind, the fixes that are occurring today, and I think you addressed it and you said you were on your second iteration over in Europe, it's going to take time. I think we just need to recognize that and, support the activities that are going on, because we are making a little bit, just a little bit of progress.
One of the great strengths of the credit card fraud prevention is the fact that there's such limited consumer liability. $50. Somebody's feeling number uses it's not $50. Are there any, the legislation
So
You're not stuck with defaulting on mortgage deposit.
the question for folks who couldn't hear is, if you look at, you get a credit card today, typically the liability is limited to $50, and I think actually, as a matter of fact, it's usually zero, and they're not going to go after you for anything because they'd rather have you keep the credit card. The question was, is there anything forthcoming in legislation which protects consumers and limits their liability? I haven't seen anything specifically about that, to be honest with you, and I think that it's a challenging one to figure out exactly how to do that. Because even in the case of, let's say, someone uses your credit card, I think that the bigger issue is when someone actually fraudulently opens up accounts in your name. That's not necessarily, I mean, even there, you're protected in terms of your liability. You know, you're not necessarily liable for what that person does, but there's a cost in time and money to fix all that stuff, and that's the thing that's actually, I think, more difficult to help consumers with.
So we've been talking a lot about laws. Sorry, Scott. We've been talking a lot about laws. One of the things that here is a technology conference or a security technology conference. Equifax has a service that they'll offer to businesses where instead of the business getting your social security number, seeing your credit report and making a decision on it, Equifax will take that data and then give the business a credit score and say, here's how much credit you should give that person. And so the business doesn't actually need the personal information as much as it might have in the past. Do we think that this is something, and I'm going to say this is a social and legal problem more than it's a technology problem, but is there technology or technological advances that we could use to make the problem less severe?
Well, I think that we need to talk about whether you're talking about, is there technology that will help the issues to do with identity theft and personal information versus the security controls that actually protect that data. I mean, it's very different to, say, encrypt all the data so that an unauthorized person can't get access to it versus what you're, a control like you're suggesting, which is perhaps we can come up with a way of doing certain business processes without ever needing to store the data. So the answer is yes on both counts, and including social changes and a set of controls that will make this different. I mean, like for one example that I have that the whole impact of 1386, the California law for notification, which is now sweeping the nation and soon to sweep Europe, you back there. The gubernator will fix your wagon too. But the thing about 1386 is that how many people, or can anybody tell me what the government penalty for violating 1386 is? What is it?
The person whose information was lifted could file a lawsuit against the government.
Very good.
Repeat the answer.
Actually go in and shut down the business while the investigation is
Right. The answer, which was correctly given, is that it opens you up to unlimited civil liability. There are no penalties. And as a similar situation, HIPAA, the HIPAA enforcement rule, again, against the security rule for HIPAA. They said that basically, if you violate the security rule with HIPAA, they're going to put the emphasis on helping you fix the problem. So you could look at that and you could say, oh, well, look, they're not going to enforce these things. So where's the penalty? Where's the social sort of pressure on the organization to stop doing these things? And where it comes from is in civil liability. And in basically what happens in HIPAA is that they're going to go help you solve the problem, but at the same time, they're going to put a big red X on you that says, by the way, this organization doesn't protect information well enough. Now, are there any insurance company CISOs here? Any? Oh, look, there's one. I mean, from a brand from a brand damage perspective, Scott, how would you feel if your company was found to have not enough security information? You think you might lose some policyholders? Yeah, he said it seems likely. Yeah, so.
Hey, I know, David, you had your hand up back there a couple times.
So the question was, one of the, we've talked a lot about accuracy of data, and David's question is, how do people feel about the fact that companies have this data and you don't even know about it? And so how do you ask for accurate data if you don't know who has the data? And just sort of the quick comment I'll have on that is, there are actually two debates going on, and they're slightly different. There's a security debate, and there's a privacy debate. And David's question is mostly, I think, about a privacy debate. And that's an important debate to have, and it's something that we should have. But I will posture that we'll never solve the privacy debate until we first solve the security issue. Because you can't have privacy without appropriate security in place. And I think what we need to do is get people to have better security policies, which means they understand where the data is, they understand what they have and how they're protecting it, because then they can start to actually do stuff with it to get a better handle on it, to give more privacy control.
I'm going to take a slightly different tact and say, it's a great question, David, but the answer may be that secondary uses of data without your permission are prohibited. That's the way things are in the European Union. They have a credit system there. And perhaps if we don't allow your data to be sold, one of the companies that's reported a breach was Merlin Information Systems in Minnesota. Has anyone ever heard of Merlin Information Systems? Anyone? All right, we have. But, you know, should the information that's at the center of this, the driver's license number, the social security number, is not natural data. It's data that the government creates, the government provides, and the government may be able to legitimately restrict trade in that information. And so that may be another answer to the question.
I think Scott is absolutely busting. I picked on him, so I feel like I should let him have his.
I wonder if the panel would comment on looking at the problem from a slightly different perspective, in that we're very much focused, or we're very focused on looking at legal controls and security controls and protections and so forth. And I wonder if there's something to be said for looking at the demand side of the problem perhaps as well. It's sort of like, I feel like we're talking about the front door. You know, if we can just seal the border, then we'll be okay. But as long as there's demand, it keeps coming somewhere. We can't seem to deal with the problem.
You want us to eliminate criminals? You want us to eliminate criminals?
No, I suggest that.
Scott's question was about the demand for personal information and the uses of that personal information, and maybe we should be looking, using the drug war analogy, we should be looking at the buyers, not just the sellers.
And looking at some ways to reduce the value of the information so that it's less criminal demand to go out and get it.
And are we talking about companies sharing information that makes it populated, or are we talking about the bad guys?
You're a panelist. You decide what
Yeah.
you'd like to talk about.
Wait, you were talking about the companies. Yeah, see, because it's easier to address the company sharing information because you can legislate them, but criminals, by definition, are violating law.
That's what I'm saying, is that they're stealing certain pieces of information because those pieces of information have value.
Oh, right. I remember this conversation now. What we're talking about is there a way to lower to lower the value of the data from a social context, to make it such that a social security number no longer is the basis to create all identity theft?
Credit freeze actually is a step in that direction, right? Because if credit freeze is more widely used, then I could give away my social security number on my forehead. Everybody can do it.
But it would be really ugly. It might fit in over at DEF CON, though. So, do you guys want to make some comments?
Yeah, actually, I want to make a couple comments. There was a comment I heard, I forget who made it earlier, about perfect security. And looking at it from a corporation's perspective, from an economic perspective, when you enter into any kind of business negotiation or business transaction, whether as a consumer, there's an amount of risk there. Part of the risk of using credit is that you have to give somebody your information. Oh, I get a mic. Look at this. So my point was that if you're entering into a transaction, be it, when you're using credit, you're putting yourself at a certain amount of risk. So there was a comment earlier made about perfect security. I think we all here particularly understand that you're never going to get to perfect security. And we can put up all the fences with the barbed wire and the machine guns and whatever else. Somebody's still going to get through. And these data stores that we have, that are out there are hundreds of millions of names in some cases. So I think we have to look at other answers than just the idea of the consumer. I think they're getting an impression that if we just do enough, that we'll have this perfect security and they can just go on happy and do the transactions that they want to do and never have to worry about anything. So I agreed earlier with the other point that there is an onus on the consumer to do their part in this and do this defense or layered defense type concept as well. I had another point and it's just left me.
Paul, do you want to?
I'll come back.
Wait, we'll come back to you when you.
We've talked about the laws, we've talked about the onus on corporations and the liability that can come there. Can you speak to the sort of the transactional integrity when I need to do something with my bank? There's a problem. I don't necessarily know who my bank is anymore. Did that letter come from my bank? Did this caller come from my bank? Is that website my bank? So there's a trust issue from a consumer standpoint of how do I know that that is my bank that is in front of me? The bank has the same problem. How do they know you are you? You mentioned a minute ago, just call up Equifax and review your information and change. They have to change whatever it is. In the banking world, I come from the payment side. The biggest problem that we're having in the banking system right now is account takeover. You call the bank and say, I moved or I got married. Here's my new name, here's my new address. And the bank says, asked you 3 questions, then they change it. Well, it wasn't me. So the bank doesn't know who I am. I don't necessarily know who the bank is. There's a trust issue and a fundamental integrity sort of on the transactional side that either should or shouldn't happen.
I'll agree with you 100%, but I'm going to highlight and use this as a great example. It's a dynamic, ever-changing environment. I would suggest to you today, no matter what defenses you put in place, you're still at risk. And you may solve the problem today. Tomorrow, the technology is going to either change, the technique's going to change, the individual is going to become an employee to circumvent all the systems. So it's a general understanding and acceptance that it's going to occur. There are tools and techniques out there. We could spend all day talking about them. But I think what we have to realize is if we're going to do business at all, not even just online now, there is a risk. Because I'll tell you the number one way that people perform identity theft is going to your mailbox. So unless you want to stop having mail delivered to your house, you are at risk, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Is this problem big enough that it could fundamentally undermine confidence in our systems, or is it not big? You're saying it's going to take a long time, and we just have to deal with that.
No different than just criminals. I mean, some people react differently to how they protect themselves as an individual. Certain people accept certain risks. Not everybody in here has an alarm system. Not everybody in here may carry a personal weapon or go to self-defense courses. I think what we're going to see is it's a natural evolution of our lifestyle, and it will change the way that we do things. But ultimately, yeah, it's going to change. It will change, just like our world's changing today based on terrorism. Our world changes today based on new technology.
Well, it's not really going to be a problem because 2006 is the year of PKI. So.
I'd like to.
Is that a Gardner quote? Can I quote you on that?
I'd like to add to what Rich was saying about, in response to Bo's question, and ask: is information the right way to be building all of these systems? If the information at the core of these systems is unreliable, what does that lead to? I'd also like to ask if maybe we could get the questioners to line up so that we're not running around trying to figure out who's next and ignoring half the questioners.
You know what? I'll just continue to play
Okay,
runner
very
because
good.
we've only got about 15 more minutes.
Okay.
And I'll just. Okay, are we ready for next comment?
Yep.
So on the general topic of mitigating the risk, is it true or is it not true that I don't own the information that third parties have about me? Whereas in Europe, for instance, I would own that information.
I think you may be incorrect on your ownership of the information. You have certain rights to affect it under European law, but European law does not give you ownership of the information that someone has about you.
But for instance, if I wanted my information removed from a database, a medical records database in Germany, for instance, I could, I believe, call them and say, please remove my information. I don't believe I have that right in the U.S. with even first-party carriers, much less third-party carriers.
You don't have that right in the U.S.? There's a fascinating argument that you should own the data about you that's distributed around, but that's not my understanding of the European law. Despite the fact that you have rights.
I might have to track down our friend from Europe, but I believe that the key word we're looking for here is choice. And it's part of safe harbor, and it's part of European law, which basically says that you do have the ability to call up and say, now, not in all cases do you have the ability to say, I want you to remove it, but you do have, they have to, in some cases, seek your permission to gather the data on you in the first place. They can only use it for the purposes that they specify, and you have the right to make sure that it's accurate. I don't know if you have the ability in all cases to say, I want you to delete all of my information. Like you couldn't do that with the government. But I'm not entirely sure how all that.
Move. Come on, you can run a little bit.
Oh, wait, go ahead.
I think mine is more of a comment than a question. It seems like there's a lot of legislation that comes down to companies that says you have to protect this data, you have to meet these certain standards. But I guess my question would be, or comment, why aren't companies being more enforceful to their customers that are using this service and saying, you have to ensure that you're protecting our data when you're using our systems, and take them through a risk evaluation process and do that. It seems like a lot of companies are being, they're just looking for the sales and not really pushing back on their customers to say, stand up and protect our data. And some of the break-ins that we've heard in the past couple months have been customers mishandled access into systems and they were compromised because of that.
Your point is valid, and I can tell you from personal experience that companies are requiring their partners to take greater steps to ensure that their information is being protected. 3 years ago, a typical questionnaire a company might get from a partnership would be, do you have a security policy? Yes or no. Do you have a network security team? Yes or no. It'd be a one-page document. Today, and it's different for every company, and I know there's several people in here that lead companies that know this, those questionnaires can be 1 page, and those questionnaires can be 86 pages. So I foresee that coming. In fact, I can tell you it is coming, and organizations are doing that. But at the same time, I will also tell you from experience, some companies have developed standards that they themselves can't achieve. So I think in order for that to be truly effective to the desired level that we're looking for, there kind of needs to be some type of generally accepted security standard established, published, and moved on to allow that to happen. Because if not, we probably have, let's just say 50, 60 companies in this room. If we all asked you to sit down and write your security requirements, and then each one of us exchanged them and said, answer all the questions, we'd be spending all of our time doing not that and not implementing technologies and developing new policies. So we have to be careful what we ask for. But your point, I think, is very valid, and it's coming fast and it's coming furious. There are some organizations, Bank of America had a whole team, and I can't remember, but it was a quite large team. That's all that they did was to go out and evaluate their third parties. So it does happen. I think it's just starting to spread, amongst small to medium businesses as well as other enterprises.
The most bizarre thing that I've heard from this panel is this emphasis on the responsibility of the consumer. The reason I find it bizarre is because I'm not really in control. It cannot be really made an analogy with the personal computer. I own the personal computer. It's in my house. I can operate on this. I can load whatever program I want. In this case, the information is somewhere else.
Right.
So how can I protect it in a certain sense beside the basic things? You know, don't put your social security number on your checks or those kind of things. In other words, it seems to me that only if the companies who are storing and trading this data are made liable, they will have the economic incentive to protect them. In other words, in the world that we are living now, if I am a company that doesn't protect this data, I don't spend that money that is necessary for the security and so on. I have an economic advantage in a certain sense. Yes, there is an issue of liability and so on, but it's not that strong, especially if I'm a small company, especially if I'm a newcomer or something like this. I would like to understand better why the consumer itself should be, in a certain sense, held responsible for this problem.
I'd like to point out that I think it's a reflection of reality right now more than, we're not advocating that, well, I think Joseph is, but
I'm going to be the first one to respond to that one, actually, so if you let me, I'll do it.
Yeah, go ahead.
So if folks got the impression that I personally think that consumers have the responsibility, that was not what I meant to say. What I meant to say, so the way when people ask me, I remember 3 years ago when I first was spending time on Capitol Hill in Washington talking about this issue of identity theft. 3 years ago, people were like, is this really a problem? Today, everyone's like, okay, how do we solve this problem? And when I try to describe how we solve the problem, I think there's actually three areas of focus for this country as well as other countries to deal with this problem. The very first thing that we need to do is better protect the data. And it's whoever has that data has to have a stronger sense of responsibility and liability for protecting it. And that's companies, it's also government organizations, it's anyone that stores the data. So that's the first step, is to better protect the data. But that alone is not going to solve the problem because, as we know, security is not perfect. It's a journey. It's not a destination. So the second thing that we need to do to solve this problem is much more around the area of detection. And by detection, I mean that if the data gets out somehow, we have to do a better job of finding out when people are doing something illegitimately with that information. And in that case, that's a lot about law enforcement. That's about going after the criminals that are actually getting access to this data, stealing the data, pretending to work at a company to steal it, however they're getting it, going to someone's mailbox. When they actually go to commit a crime, we need to go after them. And last year, actually, we passed a law in this country that increased the penalties for when people go and do identity theft. Before, if you were to call the police or the FBI or Secret Service to go after someone, they'd say, it's not worth it because the penalty to go after someone is minuscule. So we have to do a better job of detecting it. The third area to solve this problem is in the area of correction, which is where I think the consumers have a role to just understand that this is out there and they need to take a certain responsibility, and we need to give consumers better tools for them to get a stronger sense of ownership and ability to correct the problem. And I think if we do all three of those things together, that's the way we start to solve this issue of identity theft. But let's also remember that these issues that have happened over the last 9 months, again, we haven't had 60 million incidents of identity theft. What we've had have been 60 million records that potentially have been put at risk or exposed, and we should just make sure we don't blow it out of proportion. So those three things, I think, are the things how we solve this problem long term.
So 2 comments. One, I personally would very much like to see more legislation in this area. Of course, that's going to fall into 2 areas. What we're seeing currently is the push towards the notification requirements. Okay, fine. We've also talked in this room about increased privacy legislation based on the European model. But just want to agree with the statement as well that the cost to the economy of further restricting movement of information and access to credit. And I don't frankly see any legislator standing up to push legislation like that if it's going to mean an instant recession, because it's harder for people to go out and buy stuff. That's what's keeping our economy going right now is the fact that people are going out and buying their big screen TVs because they just got instant credit. So, and the second bigger point is that we've focused very much on the legislative and the technical aspects of security and privacy, but in the case of ChoicePoint and a year or 2 ago there was the instance with Ford Motor Credit. These are business process issues fraud and people leveraging business processes that perhaps weren't designed with good enough controls and segregation of duties in place. You can throw any amount of security at the problem, but if you don't examine your business processes to ensure that you're monitoring for things like, oh, this operator, this customer service agent is suddenly withdrawing 10 times more credit reports than they have in the past, that should be a red flag. And we know how to put great technical controls in place, but I think there's not enough focus in enterprises on protection of PII and people who do have authorized access and keeping an eye on what they're doing. And there was a comment made in a column I read recently saying that compliance does not equal security, and it's very true, because we saw at card systems, they were compliant. They had demonstrated compliance as they needed to, but they just weren't following processes, and the people who were saying, yeah, we're compliant, didn't know that, well, they had people with PII on laptops that had gone out.
To really summarize what you said, I would agree with you that there's a business improvement responsibility. I mean, the analogy you always use is if you're sitting in an office for 10 years and you sit in a white office, well, within those 10 years, those walls might start to turn yellow. You may not look at that yellow until somebody else walks in your office and says, my goodness, well, I didn't realize, your paint was yellow. So I think when you look at the issues that have occurred this year in the business processes, it goes back to that basic premise of good, sound security practices, which is test and validate your standards, your procedures, and your processes. And that costs money, and it also causes a change in culture. When I was the Chief Information Security Officer at ChoicePoint, after the event occurred, I probably received about a dozen phone calls from other security officers around the country, saying, man, I'm glad you're in the hot seat and I'm not, but boy, you made us really look at the way we were handling personal identifiable information in our company, and we're making some dramatic changes. So, it's unfortunate that we've had 80 plus advertised breaches, but the positive point from that is I think people are beginning to look at those processes, legislation's being talked about, and it's going to be a problem that's going to be looked at, I think, for several years.
Let me make a comment about this compliance issue. I mean, saying compliance doesn't equal security is absolutely right. You can be completely compliant and do absolutely nothing that actually benefits the risk profile of your organization. So, we're always encouraging organizations to do what's right for their company, and then they will, by the nature of doing the right thing, be compliant. Organizations, the ones that are failing are the ones that are trying to take the compliance issues from a line item perspective and address each one and do the minimum necessary. Being compliant didn't help card systems ultimately. Like you said, they're going to be out of business because all of the people that were doing business with them are backing off. So that brand problem, or the brand risk, is more significant in their case. I think we got time for one more comment.
So assuming that organizations hold the responsibility, and as Paul pointed out, that no one's really doing it that well, and also knowing that it's impossible to do it perfectly, the question that I keep having is, the way these laws are written is that the organizations must follow the prudent man approach. They must follow a prudent approach to being able to protect this information. I'd like to know what the panel would believe a prudent approach is, besides just following good standard security practice. I'm sure Joe would probably like to answer that.
I'm not a lawyer, I swear. So actually, most of the legislation, to be honest with you, how it works, do you guys remember, was it like Schoolhouse Rocks? You guys remember that when you were a kid? A bill and law and all that stuff. So how it actually works is that a law gets passed, let's take Gramm-Leach-Bliley. It has like 4 lines around data security, Section 501B. That's it. It doesn't really say a lot. So what happens is that there are these agencies. In the case of Gramm-Leach-Bliley, there's a whole set of financial services agencies, and what they do is they create rules and provide guidance. And those rules and all the guidance, I think roughly every 18 to 24 months gets updated. And what was in the rules 4 years ago is different than it is today. And I think what we're going to see is basically a similar structure in place, not just for financial services organizations, but taking that, having a broad requirement around data security, and then we'll see rules promulgated by most likely the FTC, which is what covers every non-financial or healthcare organization. And they already have rules, it's called the safeguard rule, which goes through, and they're allowed to change that on a very regular basis, and they're expected to change that and update it on a regular basis. So to deal with this question about what's reasonable and prudent, that's the whole idea of these enforcement agencies. They're supposed to set that and review that and update that as new things come about. So that's kind of how it's going to work. And I don't think any of us could say, here is the thing to do. And I spent a lot of time in D.C. saying, don't legislate technology. That's the wrong answer. Don't put into a bill you have to use encryption, for example, because that confuses things.
Well, it would probably be appropriate for me to wrap up my comments then on this. What we tell clients who come to us with that very same question is, how far should we go? And essentially what I tell them is that you have to do, because the laws don't tell you what to do, the guidance doesn't tell you what to do, and the case law doesn't tell you what to do. Do I need an intrusion detection system to be compliant or to go far enough? The answer isn't there. Therefore, you have to do what's reasonable and appropriate based on reasonably anticipated risks to your organization, based on ongoing risk assessments. You have to determine the regs recognize that you can't protect yourself from everything. Reality recognizes you can't protect yourself from everything. So you do a risk assessment to determine what you're really afraid of, and then organize that in a proactive, process-oriented program, apply measurability, transparency, and accountability to your actions, and then you will probably be doing what a prudent person would do. The problem with this approach is nobody is doing it. And that's the big issue. If companies would start doing these things, a lot of these issues that we're having would frankly go away to some degree.
You mean Gartner's not doing it? Sorry.
We're doing it.
My closing comment to your question is really start somewhere. I guess you asked for kind of what the panel thinks. Start somewhere. Classify your own data in your own organization. If you at least start moving in some direction instead of staying static and waiting for legislation to come, you'll have the opportunity potentially to be in compliance sooner rather than later. Go back to the basics. Don't try to make things too complex.
Okay, so to sum up real quickly, I think that we're going to see a lot of new laws, a lot of new practices. You can get ahead of those. We're also going to see a lot more controversy around this issue. Looking at what you're doing as a person, as a company, you can spend a lot of time and energy very productively. And so I'd like to thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating. I'd like to thank my panelists. And also I'd like to thank Rich, who showed up after the incident with ChoicePoint and was willing to be on the panel today. Thank you, Rich. Thank you all.